Start. Okay, we are about to begin our next study here, going through the Gospel of Luke together. Before we get there, I want to just do a quick set of context to the Gospels and to the Gospel of Luke. You know, the Gospels don't appear in your Bibles until, gosh, about 40 books in. So there's a lot that happened before then. And thousands of years of biblical history have passed before we get there. So if you have your Bibles with you, if you guys have something in front of you with those, because it's going to be hard for me to reference the scriptures with these notes here this week. So if you could have them ready, and then we're going to go and take a look at a few passages. So I want to start with Matthew, a little bit of historical context to all the Gospels, not just the Gospel of Luke, which we will zero in on. And I think the historical context can be very important, especially for Luke, because Luke is more than any other a true historian. He gives details and names and places and really goes much more in depth and carefully documents what's happened and transpired. So I want to go through briefly the history, and I want you to notice there are three major sections of history we see in the genealogy of Matthew. If you want to turn there to Matthew chapter 1, and let me find my notes too. Okay. And let's see. When you get there, Rob Roy, would you start us off here? Matthew 1, and we're just going to read just the kind of first verse, and then we're going to skip down after that to the end. So let's start with just the first verse here.
Okay, this is from the NASB.
Yeah.
The record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham.
Okay. And then if you look at your notes, look at your text, you'll see he starts off with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, beginning the son of David, and then the son of Abraham. He seems to section out those two parts here. And then the genealogy, if you notice, goes verse 2. It starts with Abraham and ends with what in that first paragraph, verse 6?
David.
David, yeah.
David, yeah. So Abraham to David. And the second section begins with David and goes to what?
Birth of Jesus.
Say it again, Liz.
I said the birth of Jesus, but Mary and Joseph.
Oh, no, verse 11. That paragraph. I'm sorry.
Goes to Josiah.
Yeah.
Josiah, and what time? And the Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers, and what was the timing of that?
The exile of Babylon.
The exile to Babylon. And then we get the exile to Babylon to the birth of Christ. So the three major sections of Jewish history in Matthew's gospel is from, we start with the patriarch Abraham to King David. It's about 1,000 years. And then from King David to the exile in Babylon, that's another 500 years or so. And then from the exile in Babylon to the birth of Christ, another 500 years or so. What's the significance? He picks out, in Matthew's gospel, he has two folks here, Abraham and David. And without looking, if you remember, what were the promises given to Abraham?
Be made a great nation.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a nation.
To be blessed.
Blessing of all to everybody who blesses him.
Blessing to all the nations.
Yeah.
And the land.
And the land, right? So the nation meaning descendants here. Okay, so that was that's the first promise. We read through that in Genesis 12, and that was the whole focus. So much of the book is God's fulfilling, coming back to that promise, and Christ is presented as the fulfillment of all of that promise to Abraham. What was God's promise to David, if you can remember that? So
he'd always have somebody from his family on the throne.
Yeah. So David's he would establish the throne of his son. Basically, David's son would reign forever. So in 2 Samuel 7, from David wants to build the temple for the Lord, and the Lord said, "You're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house, and it's your son whom I will establish his throne forever. And so here he is. He's the son of Abraham who will bring the blessings to all the nations. He is the David's son who will reign forever. That's the Messiah. And then it moves to the third part, which is going to be very important for the context of the Gospels, is the exile from Babylon to the birth of Christ. The things that happen in that time are setting up the players that we're going to meet, because you're going to see different crowds of people like Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, Zealots. I think some of these other groups here. Caesar, you've got Pontius Pilate, you have all these characters, Herod, that there's no mention of anything like them in the Old Testament. There's no mention of Pharisees or Sadducees in the Old Testament, or Herodians or Zealots or things like that. These are characters that develop really during what's called the intertestamental period, about those 400 years or so between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, when the people of Israel are in exile. So I want to do just kind of a brief review of what that exile looked like. So to do that, actually, Claudia, we're going to take the passage you're going to read for Sunday, Daniel 2, if you want to turn there. We'll give you a chance to practice that for us here today. And if you remember, it's Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So if you remember, after the kings have gone so far astray, and after David takes the throne and his son, they just fail. And God determines that we're going to kick them out of the land, and he sends them into exile under Babylon. And while they're in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has a dream that is driving him crazy. And so we're going to pick it up in Daniel chapter 2 and verses 17. Well, we're going to pick it up the interpretation of his dream in verse.
Is it 31 and 45 that I'm
Yeah,
reading?
31 down to 45. So would you read that for us here? Go ahead.
Yep. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth.
All right, we're going to stop right there. So this is the dream. He's about to be told what it means, but what was the dream without the interpretation of it? What did Nebuchadnezzar see in his dream?
Statue.
He sees a statue. It's a peculiar statue. How is it constructed?
Got different zones of different materials from the head down to the feet.
Yeah, what were the materials and what parts were what? So the head was what?
Gold.
Was gold.
Nebuchadnezzar.
We're not going to interpret it yet. Just yet. Get the picture here. So the head's gold. What's
Sorry.
next? What's below the head?
Silver,
The chest and arms are silver. And then the next one?
bronze,
Yeah, the middle and the thighs are bronze. And then the last part is
clay,
Iron
and
and
iron.
clay.
iron, and then the feet are of iron and clay. Okay. So that's the first scene there. Okay. But then what happens? Because this dream is not really about a statue. It's about something completely different.
Right.
Yeah, no.
What's this dream really about?
Right.
Oh.
The feet get struck and basically destroys the whole thing.
What strikes the feet?
A rock out of nowhere.
A
The rock
stone,
of-
not cut by human hands.
Mm.
But that's not the end of the dream. What happens to the statue?
It
Hmm.
gets smashed.
The whole thing
collapse.
collapsed and
and it gets swept away completely. But is that the end of the dream?
no.
No.
No, what happens next?
Well, it says ultimately that the stone, that what's represented by the stone is going to have a kingdom that doesn't pass away.
It doesn't say that. What does the dream itself say? And looking at verse 35, what happens to the stone?
But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth.
Yeah, so the stone becomes a mountain that fills the whole earth.
Yeah.
That's why it's like we know it as the dream of his statue, but it's really not about a statue. It's about a stone that becomes a mountain
Right?
that fills the entire. That's the most remarkable part of the statue, of the dream, I should say. But unfortunately, it's like because the statue is so vivid with the gold, silver, bronze, and you're picturing that, you forget that something happens to it.
Right.
Stone strikes it, and the stone becomes the mountain. And now Daniel is going to interpret the dream for us here. So who's got Liz? Would you get 36 to 45? You have that?
Yep. That was the dream. Now we will tell the king what it means. Your Majesty, you are the greatest of kings. The God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. He has made you the ruler over all the world and has put even the wild animals and birds under your control. You are the head of gold. But after your kingdom comes to an end, another kingdom inferior to yours will rise to take your place. After that kingdom has fallen, yet a third kingdom, represented by bronze, will rise to rule the world. Following that kingdom, there will be a fourth one as strong as iron. The kingdom will smash and crush all previous empires, just as iron smashes and crushes everything it strikes. The feet and toes you saw were a combination of iron and baked clay, showing that this kingdom will be divided. Like iron mixed with clay, it will have some of the strength of iron, but while some parts of it will be as strong as iron, other parts will be weak as clay. How far did you want me to go?
To 45.
Okay, this mixture of iron and clay also shows that these kingdoms will try to strengthen themselves by forming alliances with each other through intermarriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron and clay do not mix. During the reigns of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. That is the meaning of the rock cut from the mountain, though not by human hands, that crushed to pieces the statue of iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. The great God was showing the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true, and its meaning is certain.
So here we have, he says, let me explain the dream to you. Let's talk about the statue here. Who is the statue? So he starts with the gold head. And who is the gold head? Or
Nebuchadnezzar.
that's Nebuchadnezzar. There you go. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And it's interesting that the gold that's really so notable about the Babylonian Empire too. It was the most glorious and wealthy and exquisite of kingdoms. I mean, you even have I believe in the Museum of Fine Arts down in Boston, they have remnants that they show from the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. Some of they have the lion, the mosaics there, they're incredible. And he's the one who's the gold head, but he says to him, that kingdom will be replaced by a second kingdom, not as glorious. The silver, who was the second kingdom? You can see it.
Persians.
The Persians, yeah, the Persians. So the Babylonian Empire, they ruled the world. This is called the Age of Ancient Empires, when the whole world was just dominated for several hundred years by these ancient empires that ruled the civilized world, something that they had not seen before. And the Babylonians take over 605, and they kind of rule, at least particularly Israel, in that area, until about 538. When the Persians take over, by the way, do you know how the Persians did it? How they conquered the Babylonians?
They just walked in, didn't they?
It was a coup. They just kind of snuck in, killed the leadership, and basically told everybody you're under new management. That's all it is. They weren't great battles. In fact, I think if you remember the scene where the Babylonian king was with the handwriting on the wall, and he's getting drunk and he's getting wasted, and Daniel says, tonight it's over for you. And And sure enough, that night the Persians took the palace and took over control.
Is that the one where they came in by the waterway?
I think so. I
Yeah, I
think
think so. Yeah.
they snuck in. So that really it was pretty quick and um, almost something like the Israeli Defense Fund would force might do with the way they're sneaking in everywhere. It's kind of taken over. So they do that. So the Persians take over, and so for the Babylonians, the thing that significance with the Babylonian Empire is that they, through them, God takes his people who have been so wicked, but the remnant of them, who, if you remember when we studied Ezekiel, the ones who he was pleased with, he actually, through Nebuchadnezzar, he scatters them all over the world. So they're sent into exile. So now God's people are everywhere. And of course, he leads them to places of power and influence like Daniel and his friends. Later on, we're going to see Esther and others who are just kind of placed in positions of power.
You know, what's amazing is when Saddam Hussein was in power, he had the lion as, statues of lions as, in his
Yeah.
picture with him. And that was the symbol for Babylon.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, he was very proud of his Babylonian connections there. So the Persians, when they come in, who is the first king of the Persians who when they take over? If you remember who it is?
Cyrus?
Darius.
Cyrus. Cyrus is the one. So the Persians are interesting because it's the Persian Medo-Persian Empire. So
Yeah.
it's because it's an alliance here between these two nations, the Medo-Persian Empire. The Persians were more significant, but I think Darius was the
Yep.
king of Medes,
Yep.
and Cyrus was the king of the Persians. But it was through Cyrus that God reveals to Cyrus, "You're going to rebuild the temple."
Mm.
And so he sends the people out to rebuild the temple. He gives the commission for it. And so now, after 70 years in exile, Israel, the promised land, is being restored. It's being rebuilt. Jerusalem will be resettled under Nehemiah, and then they'll complete the wall, and then you have the later story of Esther's in there. But you have this Renaissance. They're returning to the land, and this is what's called the Second Temple. So if you hear people talk about the Second Temple period of the Jews, they're referring to this time. They've completed the temple, what does it say, under Darius around 520 BC. So from 520 BC until to the time until 70 AD, this is the Second Temple period. This is not the temple that Solomon built. It's the temple that was built, I believe it was under Ezra.
Zerubbabel.
Zerubbabel, thank you. Zerubbabel built that temple. So they resettle now, and they're starting to kind of reform and reshape themselves as a nation. They're treated, somewhat tolerantly, although they have moments of severe trouble, like in the time of Esther, when they're facing extinction because of Haman. But things are looking a little more positive for them than when they were in Babylon. Then in 330, everything changes. Remember Alexander the Great? He is described, essentially, there's this passage in Daniel 8, and I remember because it goes back to, if you remember the Super Bowl in 2019, it was the Patriots were facing the Rams in the Super Bowl, and people were quoting Daniel 8 as a prophecy because it was about how the goat was going to kill the ram. Was the whole thing. And so Alexander the Great is portrayed as this goat with a single horn, just furiously rampaging through the world, and it just has this furious conquest in a matter of a few years. Takes over the whole world, and his significant contribution is Hellenizing the world, and that's if you haven't heard that term before, basically it's making the world Greek. So if you think back to My Big Fat Greek Wedding, if you remember, and the father in that show is like, "Give me any word, and I'll show you how it comes from Greeks. It comes from Greek," and he's just that's sort of their legacy is they make the world Greek in language and culture. But then Alexander suddenly dies after this, and it wasn't even in battle. He goes all the way to India, conquering everything in his way. Nothing can stop him. He sees himself as on a divine mission. And he really believes that it is his calling in life by God or by the gods, however he viewed them, of making the world one. I don't know if you know who. There's a reason why he believed that. He had a mentor, a very famous mentor, in fact, was Aristotle. Was kind of his guide. So it was like you had Socrates, and Socrates' student was Plato, and Plato's student was Aristotle, and then Aristotle's star student was Alexander, actually. And so he was a philosopher king. He wanted to unite everything and to bring everything under Greek culture and science and philosophy and make everything one. That ideology is going to greatly affect the future of the Jews that we're going to see. So after he dies, the Bible talks about in Daniel 8 how that he describes I think the Greece as sort of a leopard in Daniel 7 with like 4 wings, and its wings are plucked. And speaking of how that kingdom after his death would be divided among his 4 generals. And they're going to fight it out, but ultimately 2 of them will be preeminent and take possession. There's the Ptolemies, who were from Egypt, from the south, and then there were the Seleucids from Syria in the north. Those are the 2. And in fact, Daniel will talk about the king of the south and the king of the north. He'll talk about those characters, and that's a reference to to this battle going on during the days of the Greeks. So at first, from 320 to 198, the Israel and Judah the Jews are under the power of the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies are very tolerant of them. Sorry. They were tolerant toward the Jews. And one of the things that they did during that time around 280, the Ptolemies were passionate about Greek culture, and they wanted to sort of expand the influence of Greek and to really open up the world. And so they wanted to translate all the holy books, all the most important books into Greek. And so they got together 70, I'm going to guess some Hebrew scholars, to put together a Greek Bible for the first time. The Bible is in Hebrew, and in 280, it's called the Septuagint. The Septuagint means the 70. Those who were put together to put it together. And so they translate the Old Testament into Greek. Now that's going to be very, very important to know that, because when you read the Gospels, you're going to see Luke and Matthew and Mark, they're going to quote the Old Testament. And then when you look at the Old Testament quotes, you're going to say, wait a minute, that doesn't seem like they're quoting it correctly here. And the reason is because they're quoting the Septuagint, and our Old Testament is taken from the Hebrew. So that sometimes there'll be discrepancies in how they're translated. So that's 280 BC. So then after that, in 198, the Seleucids from the north, they're more aggressive, and they take over Israel, and they push back the Ptolemies, and they take possession, and they are hostile towards Jews. Whereas the Ptolemies were more tolerant and put up with them, but they were determined to Hellenize everybody, and the Jews were not being Hellenized as they should be. They were not worshiping the Greek gods. They were not adhering to the Greek culture. They were separating themselves. And then you have, if you remember, Antiochus Epiphanes. Do you remember the whole story of the abomination that causes desolation? Do you remember that story?
He sacrifices a pig in the temple.
Yeah. So Antiochus Epiphanes, basically, he is furious with the Jews. They just, you can say some people can blame the Jews because they don't play along. They're very difficult to rule because they demand independence, and so there's one point where he leaves on a battle to Egypt and to go and do battle with the Ptolemies down in Egypt. And Jerusalem basically is left, and the rumor gets back to Jerusalem that Antiochus Epiphanes is dead. And so the Jews, in celebration of his death, kill all of his appointees in Jerusalem and take the city. Antiochus Epiphanes finds out about it, and he's furious. And he goes back and just slaughters all kinds of people and lays waste to the place. And he begins a severe persecution, such that he makes it basically a capital offense to practice Judaism in any way. If you refuse to worship the pagan gods, if you refuse to eat pork, if you observe the Sabbath, if you are caught with the scriptures, anything that would make you Jewish, if you circumcise your sons, you could be put to death. And so it was a severe persecution. And one day he's off there, and some of his troops are come into a town, and they force the village to offer a pig to Zeus, basically. And this particular group rebels. The man's name is Mattathias and his sons, and they start a rebellion, an incredible rebellion, just incredible against all odds. And they are able, through guerrilla warfare, as unlikely as our revolution was against the mighty British Empire, they win freedom for the Jews. And during that time, Rob mentioned that indeed Antiochus sacrifices a pig in the temple. That's the abomination that causes desolation. And so then they have to rededicate the temple. That's the story of Hanukkah. And you know that. But that leads to the next part. For about 100 years, they have a level of independence. They're still not completely free, but there's a level of independence for the kingdom of Judah from 166 to 63. It's during this time that our let's see what I got here. This is where the Pharisees, I think the Sadducees too, rise during this time. And the difference between them is, if you can remember, the question is about how to live. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the Sadducees didn't believe in an afterlife or something.
Yeah,
like that.
they had some theological differences between them. The Sadducees were the priestly class.
The liberals.
Didn't they also only believe in the first 5 books?
Yes, I think so.
Yep.
The Pharisees were more like your Puritans types, you know. So this is the conflict, political conflict is. So when the Maccabees, they set up what's called the Hasmonean dynasty, and it's not ruled by kings, it's ruled by priests. So there is no king in Judah at that time. The leader was called Hyrcanus, John Hyrcanus. Some of these guys were called the high priest. So the high priest became a political figure. And that really stuck in the craw of some people of the Jews, because their expectation is the son of David needs to be back on the throne, right? That's who the kingdom belongs to. And so there's that, we're waiting for that Christ, the son of David, to take that throne. And the Sadducees, the priestly class, were more inclined toward the setup there. The challenge is how to live as a Jew in a Greek culture. That's the challenge right now. And so the Pharisees were the separatists. They were like, no, we need to be faithful to the scriptures and to the law, and go according to that, and forget all this Greek culture stuff here. And the Sadducees were much more liberal and much more accommodating to the culture. We want to be get along with them. And so they really despised each other. Again, it's the same. You think about our country today, it's exactly that way. It's between the populists and the elitists. You get the elite folks in our country, and then you get elite liberals, and then you've got the fundamentalist conservatives, and they're at it, man. It's they despise each other. But these are some of the political parties that are emerging because of this new challenge that they're facing is how do you live as God's people under a pagan empire, under pagan people? And that's going to be one of the big challenges. So we're going to keep those in mind. We come back to them.
That is the challenge today, isn't it?
It always is, yeah. At what point do you accommodate? At which point do you separate? You know, where do we take what Paul says? You know, to the Jew I become a Jew, to the Greek I become a Greek. But then at what point do we say, you know, Christ is Lord, not Caesar? You know, so how do we navigate that? I think we faced a taste of that challenge, a big taste of it, during the COVID time. You know, when the government starts to intrude into what we can and can't do as a church, now the battle becomes okay, what does it mean to be a faithful follower of Christ? And what does it also mean to be a good citizen? Where do they overlap and where do you draw the line? And it's not easy to figure that out. At what point do we stop? How far should we concede to their demands? And at what point do we say no? You know, so that's a challenge. That's a real challenge. And I think churches really struggle with. Thankfully for us, it only lasted a few months. And then we get back to somewhat of our business. But just imagine that challenge being set before you for not just a few months, but for decades, for years, for your entire life, even centuries. How do you navigate that? So after 63 BC is when the Romans come in now. And that's a significant, and that's the fourth one. So we have first the gold was Nebuchadnezzar, the gold head. The silver is the Persian Empire, longer lasting, but not as glorious. The third, the Greek Empire, the bronze, begins with Alexander and again hands over to his followers. And then you finally have the iron. And that's the key one of when that stone will hit, is during the Fourth Empire, the Roman Empire. 63 BC is when Pompey takes Jerusalem and he sets up the province of Judea. Julius Caesar defeats Pompey, and he is friends with a man named Antipater, and he appoints him the procurator of Israel. Antipater will be the father of Herod. And so it's in 42 BC that Mark Antony now appoints Herod as the Tetrarch of Judea. And again, Herod's is a curious one because it's during this time, this kingdom here. I'll add one more thing that happens during this time is that the kingdom of Judah actually expands and takes possession of Edom. Now, who are the Edomites, if you remember?
Esau's people.
Yeah, these are the descendants of Esau. And so the Edomites become citizens of the kingdom of Judah. So let me put that in there real quick. And now what happens is this is Herod, if you remember, is not a Jew.
Right.
Herod is an Edomite.
Yeah.
And so now he's going to become the king of the Jews. Think about that. How well would that go over with our folks here? And then we have, hang on a second here. So the Jews revolt when he's made tetrarch in 40 BC, and Herod escapes and goes to Rome. And in Rome, he's appointed the king of the Jews. So that goes over really well, I'm sure. And then to just put salt in the wounds, Herod comes with a Roman legion to retake Jerusalem in 37 BC. And then he brutally murders most of the Sanhedrin after this. And then when Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian, you remember who he becomes, Octavian?
Julius Caesar, is it?
Not Julius Caesar. It's
Oh, no, no, begins with an A.
yeah, Caesar Augustus.
Caesar Augustus, yeah.
So Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra at 30, and he confirms Herod as the king of the Jews, and even adds lands to him. Herod, you can see how much he's despised by the people after all that he's done. And so, as a sort of a act of goodwill, perhaps to get some favor back, he begins construction on the temple. He takes that second temple that was, it wasn't nearly as awesome as the original one, but he makes it awesome. And he begins its construction on the temple in 20 BC. It would not be completed until 63 AD. If you remember when Jesus is around, they said, it's taken us like 40 years to build this temple. It is an incredible, absolutely incredible complex of buildings and display, really showing the glory. So now,
So this is an improvement in Zerubbabel's temple, right?
yes, he takes.
But isn't it still less glorious than Solomon's temple?
The glory is missing. Is the glory of the Lord is not there?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The Ark of the Covenant is not.
Ark of the Covenant's not there, and so when Zerubbabel builds his temple, if you remember, there's a sadness about it because
Right.
in the first temple, when Solomon builds it, the glory of the Lord fills the temple.
Right.
Just thrilled, but this one, the glory doesn't come in; he just builds it, and it's kind of a sad reminder of what was lost. And there is no Ark of the Covenant. There's nothing. I think it was just a pole
Yes.
in the holy place, and
Yeah.
that's why when Pompey conquers Jerusalem, he goes into the holy place, like what goes into their temple and just sees a pole. Is like, what is this?
Sure.
And they're just appalled at the lack of arts and glory in there. So this is why you're going to end up with two groups during Herod's time here. Let's see if I got it here. Pull it up here. This is the time. So you have the Herodians versus the Zealots. So these are now really, whereas the Pharisees and the Sadducees are more religious groups, this is now more political groups. You can guess who the Herodians are?
Yep, Herod's boys.
They are supporters of Herod, and they have good reason to support him. Herod is corrupt and depraved as anything, but man, look at what he's done for Jerusalem. Look at the glory that he's given to us here. And we've got ins with the Romans because of him. We're riding high because he's our hope. And they see real political fortune with him. And the Zealots,
Right.
they're the violent revolutionaries. They want to they see the corruption. They want to be done with that. They want a real king. They want a proper Christ to take control.
I always was a little bit confused because they talk about the two people who were crucified with Christ. Sometimes they refer to them as what, the thieves or whatever. But I had heard that they were in fact zealots.
I think so too. Yeah, but remember, Barabbas is described as an insurrectionist.
Yeah.
And so he's a murderer, but he's an insurrectionist. I mean, he would have been one of those like Sicarii kind of guys that would have assassinated people. And so there's Barabbas, and those are probably two of his henchmen. And so that middle cross was supposed to be for Barabbas, and that Christ takes their place. So it's an interesting scene. So this is some of the politics behind it. It's a very complicated time for them. Octavian becomes Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and he establishes the Pax Romana. If you remember what that means, the Pax Romana.
Peace of Rome.
Yeah, it's the peace of Rome. And
Yeah, that is gonna, they had this philosophy called harmonia, and you wanted to get on their bad side, be thought of as a rabble rouser.
Yes.
And you're gonna take a big hit from them.
Yes.
And so that charge comes out a lot against Christians, that he's basically causing trouble. And
yes.
That's not going to go over well with the Romans. If you're
exactly right. And I think that's where you're going to get. This will explain a lot to us when we get to the time of Pilate. Why Pilate is willing to crucify an innocent man is because, again, it's like the one thing you cannot allow to happen is chaos. Peace at any cost here. We have to maintain order, no matter what. And Pilate is done for if he doesn't maintain order, and so he does what he can to try to figure that out. And why also the Jews, they make a point of, we have no king but Caesar, and that this Pilate doesn't care that Jesus is called the King of the Jews. That doesn't bother him. There's all kinds of kings in the Roman Empire. The problem is when they say he claims to when they present him as threatening Caesar's throne, that's when we come a problem. And when they say we have no king but Caesar, making that point as well, then he becomes very afraid when it starts to see that this is trouble for the Romans. We got to deal with that. So that's just a little bit brief setup for it. We'll kind of reference some of those things. So when we get to some of the characters, we'll kind of know a little bit about what's happening there. Just as a quick intro to the Gospel of Luke, if you remember who Luke was, a few things were told about him in the scriptures.
A Greek physician.
He's a Greek physician. Colossians 4:14 tells us that. And then he was a missionary companion of Paul.
He was a historian.
He's absolutely a historian. He writes just a detailed account. I'll tell you, his gospel is remarkable. I mean, all the gospels are amazing, but his is really special. I really love his work.
I think what's huge and very helpful when you look at the other gospels is Luke claims to be sequential.
Yeah.
And the other and a lot of unbelievers sometimes will laugh, tell Christians they can't shoot straight, so to speak, because the events are related in a different order in some of the gospels. And they miss that point, that the other gospel writers just take an event in Jesus' life and they insert it to make a point that they're doing. And that the unbelief the ridiculers miss that. Luke is stating exactly in the sequential order. The other gospel writers have a different motivation for putting in a story.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And you'll notice that even typically people think it's around the early 60s that he wrote it. I don't know. I think it might be earlier, because here's why. Luke is the one who wrote the book of Acts. And the book of Acts ends with Paul in Rome, which is around, I think Paul gets to Rome before around latest. Well, Paul died, I think, around 60. When did Paul die? Like 65 AD?
65, right around him and Peter, 65, right around there.
Yeah. And he'd been in Rome for a little bit, and there was other things happening. So I think he gets to Rome. I think Acts ends in the late 50s, maybe around 60. And he says that that's the second book he's written. The first book is the Gospel of Luke. So he wrote the Gospel of Luke before he ever wrote the book of Acts. So it's quite possible, maybe even in the 50s, for his letter. So when you think, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I read once that of all the epistles, Luke wrote the most in the New Testament.
Paul did.
Well, oh, no, if you count them up, Luke with Acts and Luke,
Acts,
more than all those letters.
Oh, you're thinking of lengthwise as far as how many chapters and everything like that.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I haven't counted them. We'll have to check them out. But yeah, he did. I mean, Luke's a good sized book, and Acts is too. So that's interesting. So it's written in the early 60s AD, maybe even the 50s. But notice how close it is to the actual events that are happening. He's going to be describing events, most of which are happening in the early 30s, just 20, maybe 30 years. When you think about that, it's like, how well do you remember the events of 20 years ago? How well do you remember, 9/11 was 23 years ago. Like, it's like as clear as day to me. I can remember everything I did that day. So it's like he is, he's operating off of the memories. He didn't necessarily he didn't witness these things himself. He's actually even better than that, in that he's like a journalist. He's going to the sources, going to the eyewitnesses, gathering that information. And it would have been very clear. How do you forget an encounter with the Son of God? How do you forget what you've witnessed at the cross? I mean, these are traumatic events, and traumatic in good and bad ways. They're awesome events that you're witnessing here. It's those that would say that things get distorted or twisted are like, no. It's much too close. He's not writing this from thousands of years later. It's like just 20, 30 years later. Most likely he's writing from either Rome or Caesarea, for whatever that's worth. But he is, the purpose is, let's take a look at his purpose. He tells us in Luke 1, 3 and 4, if one of you would get that. Who's got their Bible? I don't have the text with me in front of me here, but if one of you want to grab that. You got it?
Go ahead, Claudette.
Okay. Luke
Wait.
1, 3 and 4.
Whoops. Luke 1, 3 and 4. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have taught.
The NASB, instead of order down, it says to write it out for you in consecutive order.
Oh, okay.
That's how the NASB puts it.
Interesting. Yeah, it's to write an orderly historical account of the gospel. And the purpose is that believers might be fully convinced of what they've been taught. So we need that assurance. It's so important. Our faith is grounded in history. It's not based on a philosophy of somebody, or just some vision that somebody had, but real actual events and actual places that can be verified, you can go to these places. Even today, you can go to these places, and many of them, you can see the artifacts from them.
Yeah.
So it's an orderly account, very important for us to get that, so that we can be convinced of what we've been taught, so that our faith is not at odds with reason. In fact, it's consistent with it. The reason we believe the things that we have not seen, but we believe them for reason. We're not naive. There are
Right.
lots of things that I don't see, but there's no evidence for. I don't believe in Santa Claus. I don't believe in the Easter Bunny. There's no evidence for them. Not just I don't see them, there's just no evidence for them. But I do believe that George Washington existed, that he crossed the Delaware, that he won our independence, that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. I've never seen those guys, but I have absolute convinced that they existed and did those things because we have evidence of it. We have history, we have eyewitnesses, we have monuments and all sorts of things proving that this actually happened. Same thing with this. This is history. And so Luke going out the gospel is, our faith is not based upon a philosophy or a vision of someone, but actual historic events. And Luke wants to make that clear. And also to help his readers understand that the gospel is for all, both Jews and Gentiles alike. You'll notice, who does he write the letter to?
Theophilus.
Theophilus. Now, I don't know who Theophilus is, or even if it's a real person. But what Theophilus means, the name? Theo and Philos.
Well, Theo is God.
He was God, and Philos is lover or friend of God. So he's writing to either a real Greek person named Theophilus, which is significant, he's Greek, or it's not a Jewish name, or Theophilus is just a stand-in for anyone who would be a friend of God, anyone who loves the Lord.
Interestingly, he mentions the same guy when he writes Luke. First verse. Acts, I meant to say.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
So I had heard that Luke had been a slave who was trained to be a doctor as a slave, which was not uncommon then.
Huh.
And then ultimately given his freedom.
That's interesting. Yeah. I don't know. That's a good, where did you hear that? Do you remember?
I don't, it's been so long ago now. I'm sure that it was probably 30 years ago when I was doing a lot of
Yeah.
research into my faith.
Oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting. I haven't heard that before. It could certainly be true. I know that like a third of the Roman Empire were slaves at that time. I mean, it was a lot of slaves that they had.
Well,
So that,
and it made sense as to why he was so accurate about his details, because, I mean, he wouldn't have been trained as a doctor unless he showed intelligence to begin with.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and then with that kind of training.
Of course, a
yeah,
lot of the slavery was indentured servitude.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the one thing you're going to see in this gospel is that Luke really has a heart for the outsiders, for the least and the furthest from God. You're going to see so many of the stories in Luke you don't find in the other gospels. That like the prodigal son is a classic, of course, only in Luke. Really giving hope to the ones just furthest away. The thief on the cross, only in Luke do you see that story of this man who's on his last breath coming to faith in Christ and giving paradise. And so those messages, very strong messages in Luke toward the poorest, the least, the furthest from God, the not just the Gentiles, but the lowest of classes. That this gospel is for all, to the furthest ends. So it's a great gospel of grace, absolutely beautiful. So just some of the key themes we're going to see is, again, I borrowed these from the ESV Study Bible, and maybe we can just kind of read through them together. Bob Thomas, you want to read a couple of them there for me? The first two.
Sure. Key themes. God's sovereign rule over history. The promises God made through the prophets are already being fulfilled. I won't read over.
Yeah.
The arrival and actual presence of the kingdom of God. Nevertheless, the consummation of the kingdom is still a future event, a blessed hope for which the church prays.
Yeah. Yeah. So Luke's going to kind of lay out themes of the kingdom, but it's interesting. I think in Luke, he describes it more as the kingdom of God than as the kingdom of heaven, as you see in Matthew. But Luke takes more of a, and I think his vision is goes much beyond the messianic vision that you see in the Gospel of Matthew, which is written primarily for Jews, and really driving home of Christ as Jesus as the true Israel and the Messiah, fulfilling the promises. His focus is more on the like that kingdom that is for all the nations and the blessed hope that's coming. And let's pick it up from there. Elizabeth, would you get the next couple for us there?
Sure. The coming and indwelling of the Holy Spirit upon Jesus and his followers. The Spirit is present in the Gospel of Luke, from the births of John the Baptist and Jesus to the end. The Spirit is present at Jesus' dedication in the temple, his baptism, temptation, early ministry, and first sermon. The Holy Spirit is central to the message of John the Baptist, and Jesus, at his ascension, promises the Spirit's future coming in power.
Let's stop right there
The
for a
great,
second. I'm sorry.
sure.
I think that's interesting. The Holy Spirit really is a big theme when you think back to Luke. There's a lot of mention of him throughout the gospel, just like it continues in Acts. The Spirit comes upon the church, and so you're going to see a lot of that reference. I forgot a lot about those things, but even from the time of his from birth and John the Baptist and the Spirit coming upon him, very very big theme there. I'm sorry. Next one here. Do you want?
The great reversal taking place in the world, in which the first are becoming last and the last are becoming first. The proud are being brought low and the humble are being exalted. Luke places great emphasis on God's love for the poor, tax collectors, outcasts, sinners, women, Samaritans, and Gentiles. In keeping with this concern, many of the episodes that appear only in Luke's gospel featured the welcome of an outcast, the Christmas shepherds, the prodigal son, the persistent widow, Zacchaeus, etc.
Yeah, that's really interesting too. When you get to the birth narratives, if you remember the Christmas story, Matthew is the one who highlights the wise men and the Magi from the east coming and looking for the King of the Jews, and it's Luke that highlights the shepherds, the lowliest of them. And my dad always got a kick out of this because he says, you know, when he was always a man for the working man. That was his thing. And he says, you know, the wise men, it's like these great kings, these really wise guys from long far away. You know, they have to follow a star and they have to travel thousands of miles to come see the Lord. But these shepherds just out doing their job are visited by legions of angels, and the Messiah is right there for them. It's like it really shows you who God is favoring in this. He's not favoring those wealthy kings and magi from far away. He's right there among the least and the those that are just doing their job, these working guys. So I think that's a big thing for Luke. You're gonna see that. Let's pick it up from there. Let's see. Liz, you want to get the next couple there?
Well, believers are to live a life of prayer and practice good stewardship with their possessions. In Luke's narrative, prayer occurs at every major point in Jesus' life. At his baptism, at his selection of the 12, at Peter's confession, at Jesus' transfiguration, in his teaching the Lord's Prayer, before Peter's denial, etc. The danger of riches is constantly emphasized in Luke, for the love of riches chokes out the seed of the gospel and keeps it from becoming fruitful. This danger is so great that Jesus often warns his readers not to set their hearts upon riches and to give generously to the poor. The woes pronounced upon haughty rich people stand in sharp contrast to the blessings pronounced upon the humble poor.
You know, one of the things about Luke, he describes the baptism of John. And he's the only one who goes into the scene where people are coming up to John and saying, "What should I do?" They're talking about repenting. And they say, "What do I need to do?" And he gives a couple of things. He says, "If you who have 2 tunics, you know, give one away. To the soldiers, don't be content with your pay and don't take more than you're supposed to," or something like that. Just it was all about, and when they ask him about repentance, his focus in Luke's gospel, and when John speaks, we're going to get to that, is on how they handle their money and how they need to be faithful and content and generous. That comes up a lot in Luke's gospel. A lot of the parables also will address those issues. So, all right. So that's just some of the themes there. Just a quick outline of it. We'll start with the prologue and the narrative that kind of sets it up. So chapters 1 to 4 are all the setup, all the preparation for it. The birth narratives of John and of Jesus, and then his baptism and preparation for ministry. And then it launches, and it's very simply organized. You've got the ministry of Jesus in Galilee up in the north from chapter 4 to chapter 9. And then there's the journey to Jerusalem. There's about 10 chapters of his experiences there and what's going to happen, and encounters that he meets along the way. And then the final ministry of Jesus in Jerusalem, those last 3 chapters. He'll be going down and he'll have lots of arguments and discussions, and he'll get into his death and suffering. You know, in John's gospel, as we've been going through it, it's much more poetic, and you have Jesus kind of bopping around from place to place. That's why I think Luke's orderly account, you can really see it against John's account. John is more about themes, and he has Jesus going back and forth to Jerusalem. He's here, he's there, he's there, he's there. He's back and forth to different places. And Luke is very careful. He's like, look, he's in Galilee, then he travels, and now he's in Jerusalem. There's your gospel. And it ends, of course, with, as they all do, with the death and the resurrection of Christ. But Luke also will mention the ascension of Christ, not just his resurrection, which is also interesting too.
I've heard sometimes some people say this gospel was intended for these people. This primarily, you know, like Matthew is targeted to the Jews. And I've heard that said. And I've heard Luke say it's targeted to the Gentiles. What do you think of that?
I agree. I think so. Yeah, it certainly doesn't exclude the Jews, but I think that's definitely his audience in mind. Yeah, he definitely is reaching to the, and maybe because he's a Gentile,
He's a Gentile, yeah.
and if he was a slave, as you're saying, it makes a lot of sense that he would have a heart for the people furthest away from God. So
Well, he traveled with Paul, and Paul was supposed to be reaching out to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
That's
yes,
that's
yes.
who they worked. That's the group of people that they really were spending the time with.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? Hey, here's something to think about. It's like, what if Luke wrote this gospel? I'm just speculating here, but what if he wrote it during the time of his missionary journeys with Paul? What if it was like a tool that they used, or at least he was putting it together during those years and using it as a tool to teach the people that alongside with Paul. And so he's under the tutelage of Paul as he's making sure he's not only presenting the facts, but presenting them in a way that is faithful to the gospel. Because Luke is not an apostle, but he is clearly sanctioned and accepted as having apostolic authority in this, in
Mm.
writing this letter.
One other thing that I like about Luke is he's the only gospel that talks about his childhood. When he
Yeah,
gets
yeah.
at the temple,
Yeah, you have the temple too. Yeah, those are great scenes.
being a child.
Yeah.
You often wonder, how did Mary and Joseph raise this Messiah?
Yeah.
How do you do
Yeah.
that?
We get one little glimpse of it, but it's still, it's like what in the world? Yeah. It's great. So all right, let's break it here, and we'll start getting into the text next week. So let me
Great history. Thank you. That was